tardes y bienvenidos a este WOBI webinar con Martin Lindström. Estamos muy contentos que estén con nosotros hoy y también por tener a Martin aquí, alguien quien está reconocido globalmente como experto en la construcción de marcas y en cómo mejor entender el comportamiento de los consumidores. Martin, como muchos de ustedes ya sabrán, es parte de una excelente programación de speakers que tenemos en el WOBI World Business Forum en la Ciudad de México en octubre. Y hoy está aquí para darnos un anticipo de lo que va a estar presentando en el escenario del World Business Forum en octubre. Las ideas que vamos a escuchar hoy salen de investigaciones que Martin ha hecho por su último libro, que se llama Small Data, The Tiny Clues That Uncover Huge Trends. Este libro fue publicado en febrero de este año y se ha convertido rápidamente en un bestseller. La revista Forbes lo nombró como uno de sus libros que hay que leer, y la revista Inc. dijo que fue uno de los libros de negocios más importantes del año. El webinar de hoy va a estar en inglés, pero lo vamos a grabar y en los próximos días también vamos a compartir con ustedes una grabación que tiene subtítulos en español para los que requieren. Para que sepa, yo soy Chris Stanley, el director de contenidos de WOBI, y voy a ser su host para la sesión de hoy. Y en nombre de WOBI, gracias una vez más a todos los líderes, los equipos ejecutivos, todos ustedes que están participando hoy desde México, América Latina y alrededor del mundo. Antes que empecemos, quiero tomar nada más que un par de minutos para contarles un poco más sobre WOBI, quiénes somos y qué hacemos. WOBI, en esencia, es un gran hub de contenidos. Por más de 20 años hemos producido contenidos de negocios para todas las personas que tienen ganas de aprender y crecer. Y este contenido distribuimos en varias plataformas, en eventos, en televisión, en una revista empresa, y también online, en contenido digital. Y nosotros nos gusta decir que creamos este contenido para mentes inquietas, personas que son curiosas, globales en sus formas de pensar y quienes compartan nuestra pasión por los negocios. Y creemos que en el proceso de compartir las mejores ideas y prácticas, que podemos ayudar en crear mejores líderes, mejores negocios y, por último, un mundo mejor. WOBI organiza varios eventos alrededor del mundo cada año. Y bueno, aquí en México, en los últimos 15 años, estamos orgullosos que estos eventos sean convertidos en referentes para los líderes de las organizaciones mexicanas. El evento más importante del año que organizamos en México es el World Business Forum, un evento de 2 días donde miles de ejecutivos se reúnen para aprender y ser inspirados por algunas de las figuras más importantes del mundo de los negocios. El primer World Business Forum se organizó en New York en 2004 y este año, 2016, habrá eventos en Milán, en Madrid, Sydney, New York, Bogotá y, por supuesto, como les he dicho, en la Ciudad de México. Así, ojalá que ustedes también puedan acompañarnos en el evento de este año, el 26 y 27 de octubre. Ahora, el tema o marco conceptual del World Business Forum México de este año es lo que nosotros llamamos Big Data. Estoy seguro que todos ustedes reconocen que vivimos y trabajamos en un mundo donde el ritmo de cambio sigue acelerando, donde los ciclos de negocios están cada vez más cortos y es cada vez más difícil sostener una ventaja competitiva de largo plazo. Y en este contexto, vuestro programa, nuestro evento, va a investigar qué tenemos que hacer para prosperar en un mundo que está en un estado constante de beta. ¿Cómo creamos organizaciones que son capaces de reinventarse constantemente? Que son suficientemente ágiles para identificar nuevas oportunidades, experimentar y aprender rápido. Y como líderes, ¿cómo tenemos que adaptarnos para liderar mejor en este contexto? Y para explorar estos temas y mucho más, tenemos un excelente programa de speakers en el evento. Entre ellos, bueno, tenés algunos nombres ahí en la pantalla. Entre ellos, Bill Stone, el fundador de Twitter, Gary Vaynerchuk, el experto en marketing y comunicaciones digitales, Ken Siegel, quien fue el director creativo para Steve Jobs en Apple por muchos años, y a Carles Pujol, el ícono del fútbol español y el ex capitán del Club de Fútbol Barcelona. En total tenemos 14 speakers en el evento de este año y, por supuesto, entre ellos es Martin Lindström. Ahora lo que voy a hacer es cambiar a inglés para darle la introducción a Martin y después para empezar con su presentación. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, Martin is here today to give us a sneak preview of some of the key themes that he'll be discussing at the event at the World Business Forum that relate specifically to his recently published book, Small Data. His insights stem from his pioneering research in the field of consumer psychology, marketing, brands, and neuroscience. And in total, Martin is the best-selling author of 6 groundbreaking books on branding, marketing, and consumer behavior. Working with leading global brands around the world, Martin has developed what you might call an unorthodox way of doing what every company says it wants to do, which is understand its consumers' deepest desires and turn them breakthrough products, brands, and experience. Now, after Martin has finished his presentation, which will last around 30 minutes or so, we'll have 15-20 minutes to take some questions from all of you who are listening. And if you would like to ask Martin a question, please do so by writing in the question section on the menu bar. I think it says preguntas for those of you who are in Mexico. I'll be selecting those questions and putting them to Martin. You can send them in Spanish, that's absolutely fine, and make we get the translation into English for Martin. You can send them at any time, and we often get many more than we have time to get through, so the sooner you send those questions in, the better chance we'll have of actually being able to get to them after Martin's presentation. So, all of that said, it is time to hand over to Martin for his presentation. Martin, are you there? Can you hear me?
I certainly can, Chris. Good to hear your voice.
Oh, excellent. Okay, well, I'll leave the floor to you, so to speak.
Fantastic. Well, hi everyone. It's a pleasure meeting you guys, and I hope I'll get a chance to meet you in Spain very soon. But just as a build-up for the event we're going to run in Spain and in New York, I just wanted to give you sort of a sneak preview into what I'm going to do and what I'm going to talk about. I personally find it fascinating, but of course you are the jury in the end of the day. Chris, by the way, if you could sort of move the slides ahead, that would be great, because I seem to have some problems with moving. Oh, I can do it now. I think it's working. Let's see. So the story about small data is really fascinating. It's fascinating of several reasons. As you know, everyone talks about big data right now, but as obsessed as we are with big data at the moment, I fundamentally believe that there is a counterbalance to this, and that counterbalance is called small data. Now let me just pause here for a second. Just some month ago, I was sitting in North Carolina in the United States, and you can probably see the slide right now. I was sitting next to this family. They were really busy, these guys, on their phone. In fact, I think they're still sitting there. And this is really, in many ways, our lives. We are rarely present these days. We're on our phones. But what's interesting is it also means that our behavior is changing in terms of how we interact with brands and how businesses are going to function in the future. Just to give you an example, just recently reported in the New York Times, a restaurateur, so an owner of a restaurant, decided to do an unusual experiment. He sort of had been pretty sort of sad to learn that people were more and more disappointed about the service in his restaurant. So he decided to set up some internal cameras and started to film the guests as they were dining in his restaurant. And he didn't do that over a couple of months. He in fact did it over 10 years. As he collected all those amazing insights about these diners in his restaurant, he discovered something highly unusual. The study basically started in 2004, and back then an average diner would spend about 1 hour and 5 minutes sitting in his restaurant. But just within 10 years, the 1 hour and 5 minutes changed to 1 hour and 55 minutes. Now, why was that? And how come that was related to a less experience of happiness in his restaurant? Well, the answer was pretty stunning. Because what happened was that people were obsessed with the phone. The first thing they would ask about when they went into his restaurant was for a Wi-Fi code. And then secondly, they would complain about that the Wi-Fi connection was not good enough. That would take 11 minutes. And then they would sit down, they would receive the menu card, and guess what? They would take a couple of photos of that and upload it. And once they ordered the food, which by the way was late at this stage, they would wait. And as the food was arriving, they would immediately take some photos of the food, of course, and upload it and wait for comments, so they would ensure that people really would like what they saw on their social media channels. Now, that would take another 15 minutes. And on their way out of the restaurant, they, by the way, would bump into an average of 2 people, add another 3 minutes, because all of them would be on the phone, checking all the messages they received from social media. The complaints was very simple. The complaints was due to social media. In the last 2 years, humans have created some 90% of all information ever created by our species. The fact is that people believe that the answer to all this stuff is big data, and it very well may be. But what we discovered in all our work is that there is another dimension to this. And I want to hold you suspense just for a second and tell you a little bit more about what that is. Now, in order to explain that, let me take you back to 2012, because that was the year where Google came out with a pretty amazing finding. They basically had discovered that they were able to predict a flu outbreak in the United States 4 or 5 days before it would happen, just based on what people would type in on the search engine. So if people would type in flu, they would be able to say, well, 4 or 5 days before in advance, guess what? There's a flu outbreak going to take place, and in that way they could order medicine and inform the medical community about this in advance. The problem was that the whole medical community was now starting to listen to this, and they were starting to roll out a new procedure for how to warn all the doctors across the country. It was a great success. Well, until just recently, when the Center for Disease Control announced that Google was completely wrong. In fact, the numbers were twice of what they should have been. Why was that? Because people were typing in the word flu, and then the neighbor would look at it when they were visiting them and say, oh, I wonder if I have a flu too. And suddenly the word will go viral, and the numbers will completely be wrong. And this is a story about how big data sometimes, in fact quite often, can be rather misleading. Because the issue was that Google cared about the correlation rather than the causation, where they should have cared about the causation rather than the correlation. And this is really the essence of what I would like to tell you more about. How there is a new kid in town which is going to overcome the very issue that we have a ton of data but really no information. You see, in the future we're going to see a partner in a dance. The big partner is big data, of course, but there's going to be another partner in town which I define as small data. A small data is, in many ways, seemingly insignificant observations we make in computers' lives or in consumers' lives, and then it can have a pretty amazing insight about what you and I are thinking. Just to give you an example, according to the Journal of Behavioral Information Technology in 2014, that it is possible with 70% accuracy to assess how a person is feeling just based on how this person is feeling like, and because of that, how the person is typing in the various words and letters. Or another study actually shows that you, based on the typos and how frequently you use caps, and actually the type of words you're using, that you are able to, with a 79% accuracy, to determine the credit card rating of a person. That without even saying things. This is a good indication of what small data is going to be all about. It's going to be that partnership between big and small data. And the issue is that there's a lot of our small data around. We just don't see it. Because every minute we leave traces of DNA behind us. And that DNA, in many ways, are telling us some pretty fascinating insights. And just to give you an example, back in 2002, the Lego company from Denmark had a huge challenge. The challenge was that they were close to bankruptcy. They listened to a lot of the big data, and the big data was revealing that the instant gratification generation, in fact, had just arrived. So kids wouldn't have any patience whatsoever to play with Lego bricks. The Lego company, as a consequence of this, decided to change the size of those Lego bricks from those tiny bricks to gigantic building blocks. However, in 2003, Christmas up to December, the sales went down dramatically. In fact, it went down close to 30%, revealing a huge problem for the Lego company. It was that moment where a small outbreaker group within the Lego company decided to move in with various kids across Europe because they wanted to figure out what was the real reason why they were struggling. And they end up in this little kid's home, an 11-year-old boy in Oberkochen in Germany, and they sit down on his floor in his bedroom, and they ask him one single question: what are you most proud of? And this kid pauses for a second, and then he points to the shelf where there's an old worn-down pair of sneakers standing, and he says, those ones. And he takes them down, and the Lego team is kind of puzzled about why is this happening, because they thought the answer would be an old worn-down PlayStation, or perhaps a Nintendo PlayStation, something like that. But no, the answer was an old worn-down pair of sneakers. Why? They asked him. The kid paused, and then he said, well, I'll tell you why. I'm a huge skateboard fan. In fact, I'm the #1 skateboarder in town. But there's no way I can prove that, except by showing my shoes. You see, on the side of my shoes, you have a certain wear and tear, and that has an exact angle of 12 degrees. You see, when I slide down my skateboard, that is the mark created on my shoes. And guess what? This is my evidence that I'm the #1 skater in town. These shoes is my trophy. That was a second where the Lego group really paused and had realized they were watching a new revolution, because they were completely wrong. The instant gratification generation was really not at play anymore. In fact, what they learned was if a kid could spend hundreds of hours fine-tuning the right angle on the sole of an old worn-down pair of sneakers, there's a pretty good chance that if you were to use storytelling in the way you're going to play with Legos in the future, kids still would have hundreds of hours. And out of that conclusion, they decided to change the size of the Lego bricks back to those tiny bricks. In fact, they added even more bricks to the plays. And yes, they infused stories. They put the kids in the driver's seat, and later on they even created the Lego movie. They did something which was needed, but which no one knew about, just listening to the big data, and listening to the small data. And this is really the invention of that very term. And the photo you see here right now is really me sitting in action listening to consumers. And people sometimes are saying to me, how can you listen just to 20 or 30 consumers across the world and out of that create sort of a conclusion for the entire future of a corporation? Well, recently I went to the doctor having a health check in Switzerland, and he didn't take 5 gallons of blood from me, right? No, he just took a couple of drops. It was enough for him to determine if I was healthy, which I was, thank God. This is really my metaphor to explain that you don't need to know the answers from thousands of people. As long as you select the right audience, you quite often will actually have a much stronger strategy pointed out in front of you. Now, let me just give you an example. Let's go to Austria. In Austria and Switzerland, there is a major fashion chain. And this fashion chain has, for many years, been incredibly successful, targeting younger girls between the age of 15 to 20 years of age, basically selling discount clothing gear, just like what H&M and Zara is doing. There were around 1,200 stores across Europe, and they had a problem. And they realized the girls had no patience whatsoever anymore to go into those stores, and definitely they didn't want to buy the clothes from this fashion retailer. And that was the moment where we basically decided to move in with young families to understand the psychology of how girls are buying clothes. And this was fascinating. Of course, with the permission from mom and dad, we decided to observe how they're living. And what you're seeing right now on the screen is actually real footage, real photos from girls' bedrooms across Europe. Now, I need to help you a little bit because, in fact, you're seeing a retail revolution right now. It probably is not that easy, but if I sort around those photos on the screen right now, you'll notice there's an interesting pattern appearing. Because what you see here is actually the future of retail. What we learned from this was something really interesting. We learned that girls are waking up 23 minutes earlier today than they did just 10 years ago. Now, why is that? Well, we couldn't figure this out until we decided to listen to the girls' behavior. And one of the things we noticed was, in fact, that they were not spending all their time in the shower cabin as one would think. No, by looking at the hull in the shampoo bottle, it was actually smaller than it was just 10 years ago. Which really is interesting, because that for us indicates they're not spending more time in the shower. In fact, they were spending it somewhere else. A smaller hull, less time in the shower cabin. So what were they spending the time on? Well, looking at those different products they had, we noticed that the facial cream, in fact, was no longer oil-based. It was water-based, which means that your face is shining less. And by the way, the hand cream was no longer water-based. Now it was oil-based. They're also using more powder, facial powder. Why was this so interesting at all? Well, one morning we realized the real answer. The reason why the girls were spending 23 minutes every morning, not in the shower but somewhere else, was to be found in exactly those things we pointed out. The first thing they would do in the morning was to grab the phone. And yes, it's not new, but what they would do is to swipe with a finger on the phone. Now, because the fingers was just not very gluey, they would not be able to use that display, so they would use an oil-based hand cream. And yes, the second thing they'll do is to take a photo of themselves, a selfie. We knew that because they were no longer using a oil-based facial cream which are making your skin shine. They're using a water-based facial cream and putting powder on top of it, which simply made us conclude that they would take a selfie. As we went back to the big data, we started to mine all those billions of data points. We realized through the phone records, again received with permission from mom and dad, that in fact they're not taking 17, they're not taking one selfie of themselves, they're taking 17 selfies of themselves every morning. Out of that, we decided to change the entire design of the retail store. We learned that these young girls, in fact, would have to have a different experience. And in fact, we had to create a virtual dressing room in a physical store where they could basically point at a screen, upload all the closest friends from Facebook in that physical dressing room, and then display all the different friends in the dressing room while they were testing out what clothing equipment they wanted to wear. Then these friends would vote online in the physical dressing room what clothing items they liked and which one they disliked. And out of that, you would see a whole new format of how to buy clothes in a bricks and mortar store. This is a story about how seemingly insignificant observations made in people's lives, in fact, can convert into a completely new solution. In this case, a whole new way of designing the retail stores and a whole new way of interacting with girls. You see, the issue is that girls have changed dramatically. In the old days, you'll notice that they would have a bedroom, and the bedroom would really basically point back to their lives. But now the walls in the bedroom is the new social media wall instead. You'll notice that we even sit and we sleep differently in the bed. We're sleeping in the bed, yes, but we're also eating the bed, we're playing in the bed, We are doing our homework in the bed. The reality is that a lot of stuff is taking place in our lives which are completely different from what it was just 5 years ago. Now, this leads me back to the very premises of the small data book, and of course the speech I'm going to do very soon in Spain. What we know today is that we constantly, every second, are sending out seemingly insignificant observations about our lives. I call those small pieces of emotional DNAs or small data. It happens everywhere. It's the way we hang our toilet paper, the way we surf on Facebook, the way we place our photo, the profile photo on Facebook, even the way we use emojis. All of those things are telling an unconscious story about who we really are. And that in return are creating an amazing foundation for brands today and in the future. And this is really the beginning of my story. That what we're seeing today happening is that as we become more and more obsessed with big data, there is a second script taking place, which we call small data. And that is a script I want to tell you much more about when I meet up with you guys in Spain. Tell you about not just how you will have to identify these small data, but also how you can turn that into new product innovations or just find completely new consumer needs you haven't discovered before. So with that, I want to wrap up. And by the way, in the lead up to the conference, you're very welcome to visit me at martinlindstrom.com, of course on Facebook, Twitter, or on LinkedIn. Chris, I guess the word is back to you now.
Martin, thank you. Thank you very much. You mentioned Spain. Now, I know you are speaking in Spain a little bit. With the audience is mainly from Mexico. Today, just so you're aware of that, we've got most people on the call today dialed in from Mexico or connected from Mexico. We're going to take some time now to ask get some questions based on these sort of initial ideas that you presented here around small data, what small data is, and the importance of small data for marketers today, for businesses today. So if you do have any questions, if anyone would like to take this opportunity to put some questions to Martin, then this is now your chance. So I'm going to kick off whilst we wait for some of these questions to come in. Martin, what would you suggest is sort of the biggest thing that marketers need to be doing differently? What are sort of some of the biggest mistakes that you see marketing teams making at the moment, and what should they be doing differently in order to start connecting in a more effective way with their consumers?
Well, I think this is really the issue. Now, we work with some of the largest brands across the world, and consistently we're told by our clients that they know about the consumer. Yet, when we then say to them, when did you last time spend time in their homes or were interacting with them? The answer is never, or at least very rarely they did so. The first step is to spend real time with the consumer in their homes, in the real environment, because that will give you an insight which is amazing. You know, we work for some of the most important banks or postal companies or airline companies in the world, and once you think they really know what the consumer wants, they have no clue, because we've isolated ourselves so much from reality. We're sitting behind those computer screens, reading reports, and fundamentally believe that the answer can be found in numbers, but they can't, because everyone has access to the same reports. They mine the data the same way, and guess what? They conclude the same things. It is when you pick up those seemingly insignificant nuggets in people's lives, you suddenly find the foundation for a new brand or new proposition. So certainly that's what I've seen. Now, when I've done work both in Mexico and also in Spain on small data, because I spend a lot of time in consumer homes across both countries, I definitely have seen how it's possible to turn around companies just by listening to what consumers want in, let's say, in Mexico. And what I will do when we meet up in Mexico and in Spain is I'm going to show local cases from both regions where you'll see real photos from what consumers are like and what they're saying, and how local companies in fact were able to turn completely around based on what they learned. So long story short, Chris, the answer is very simple. The answer is you need to learn techniques to listen to the consumers the right way and use a methodology to get the key people in the organization into the homes or into the real lives of consumers. There's a lot of different techniques we can use, and I'm going to share all of those when we meet up very soon.
Okay, thanks for that. So Fernanda has a question here. She asked about, just sort of developing a little bit further what you were talking about there, about how you can go about getting this small data from our clients. And then in a similar line, Javier asks, and how do you decide what sort of the information is really important? There's so much information there when you're speaking with the clients and you're living with them. How do you sort of think, this is the key point?
Well, there's a couple of different techniques we're using. I have a special methodology which I call the 7C Manifesto, which really is 7 steps I'm typically using in order to assess what to look for, how to interpret that into real conclusions, and how to turn that into a real concept. But the first thing you have to do is really to remove what I call your culture glasses. We all have culture glasses, and let me just explain what I mean. Paco Underhill, which is a good friend of mine, he wrote a book called Why We Buy. When I was visiting my native Denmark some years ago, and as we were walking on the main street in Copenhagen, he said to me, Martin, people in Denmark, they walk very unstructured. And that was very surprising for me because I never thought about that before, but he was right. I suddenly saw it. Now, that was because my culture glasses were very thick. I did not see the reality. The first thing you need to do is to remove your culture glasses, because then you start to see these seemingly insignificant clues around you. And one way to do that is to go down and have a haircut, to talk to the local hairdresser, to talk to the community leader, to talk to the mayor, those people which have a really engraved view about what's happening in the local community. That will make you start to see the world more clearly. Now, a second thing you need to do when you come into the home is to look for certain clues which can tell you a lot about the person's behavior. I'll just give you a very simple example. In everyone's home, there is what we call the perception room. That's even the case in Mexico and in Spain. And the perception room is quite often in some cultures where you place your coffee table book, it may be where you have your dining table, it may be where you have some really nice stuff sitting or standing on the shelf. But in the perception room, if you look around in the perception room, you'll see that if a person has a really large, colorful painting, that actually means that that person is very, very self-confident. If you have a lot of keys, a bunch of keys hanging down from your belt, you can be pretty sure that that person, when the person was young, was pretty insecure and has gained a lot of influence when the person grew older. These seemingly significant observations, which are very small clues, what seems to be nothing, in fact tells a story. Everything from how you place your shoes to how you place your toothbrush in the cup in the bathroom, how you place your toilet paper, even the way you close your garbage bin tells a story about who you are. And that's what I want to take you through when we meet up in Mexico and in Spain, because it will give you an idea about what you should look for and how you're going to turn this into concrete concepts and solutions for your brand.
Yeah. An interesting question here from Karen has come in, and she asks, a lot of consumers today are quite skeptical, right? I think you might agree about giving their data over, and they feel like they're being observed by brands and companies. In your experience, have you found that to be a problem, that customers feel sort of insecure about inviting people like you into their homes and sort of giving up this sort of information?
No, absolutely not. First of all, we never reveal what brand I'm coming from. And we won't do that, because then certainly the information we'll get is biased. Second, I have to say, I've done an enormous amount of research in Mexico across the entire country. I think I've probably been to 200 or 300 homes, spending a day or two in each of the homes. So I spend my time fair share in Mexico in private homes, and I haven't been rejected one single time. And by the way, the same is the case in Spain. So it's very clear for me that that's not the issue. What really is the challenge, I think, is for you to not recruit people, but to be open-minded and to ask the right question, to engage with people the right way, and most importantly, use that nugget of insight back in the company with senior management. What we always are looking for is how we're out of balance. We're all out of balance. Maybe I feel I'm too overweight. Maybe I feel I don't have enough friends. Maybe I feel I don't have a partner in my life. All those out of balances reveal an insight about where there's a potential for new brand or new opportunities. So it's those out of balances we really are looking for all the time. And we do that in a dialogue with consumers. And quite often people love to talk about themselves. So I have to say I haven't experienced what you're telling me about. So it may be I should give you some hints next time we meet up, hopefully in Mexico.
Okay. A question here from Mario. We're getting loads of questions, by the way. A question here from Mario. He asked, you touched on this a little bit in the presentation, but maybe you could talk a little bit in a bit more detail about the role of social media in the small data era.
Well, it's fascinating. So, for example, the usage of emojis tells an enormous, very important story about. Remember when we talked about being out of balances? Entire countries and cultures can be out of balances. I mean, Syria is out of balance now, which is the reason why you have all these refugees coming into Europe. But you can also say, if you go to Saudi Arabia, for example, you'll see that, of course, there's not a lot of greenery around in Saudi Arabia. And that is reflected in the numbers of emojis they're using. In fact, the most frequently used emoji by Saudis happens to be a potted plant. So in Russia, where people don't smile a lot, guess what the most frequently used emoji is? That's a heart. And in UK, where they have this funny, quirky type of humor, the most frequently used emoji is the wink. So what you will see is that across every touch point, we leave these small data behind us. The way we set up the Facebook account, for example, if we have a huge photo as a profile photo behind us, it's actually the place we dream about being at. It's not necessarily where we are every day, it's our dream. It's a way for us to freeze our dream. If we look straight into the profile photo and we're alone, it actually means that you're not that self-confident. If you don't look into the camera, we know today it means that you are more self-confident. All these social media aspects are really interesting. But one thing I have to tell you is, we cannot always listen to social media. And the reason why is because what we call the arrogant mind. It is a terminology we use in the way we sort these small data. And what we've learned is that we're not necessarily always ourselves when we're online. I mean, it's a little bit the same as if you're driving your car in Mexico and you're getting crazy of the traffic, which for sure I'm doing every time I'm there. Well, then you are very aggressive in the car, you scream and you shout and you even abuse people around you. Well, guess what? That is not you. That is one person of you. That's the same as online in social media. What people are saying is not necessarily a reflection of who they are. So the methodology we're using is to pick up what type of signals are people sending, and then we sort them into different compartments so we can use that when we later on evaluate what we really should listen to and what we shouldn't listen to. So social media is important, but we also need to sometimes be fairly skeptical about what we learn.
Okay, excellent. A question here from Ireri. I think you might be talking about this a little bit more in your presentation at the event, but have you mentioned there sort of cultural differences in different parts of the world. Have you done any studies on consumers in Mexico or perhaps more wider in Latin America?
Yeah, I have. So I worked in basically every single country in South America and Latin America. So we've done an enormous amount of studies. And what I will tell you more about when we meet up in Mexico is really what the differences are. But I have to say one thing. The differences are not that enormous. I tend to say there's only 4 factors which makes us different as people around the world. It is the religion, it is the government rulership, it is tradition, and it's the weather. If you take those 4 things aside, you will learn that we are surprisingly similar. But I have picked up a range of fascinating insights about how Mexicans are different from some of the neighbor countries, and I promise you, I'm going to tell you more about them when we meet up in Mexico.
Okay, excellent. If you wanted to, so going back to the methodology a little bit, and I know we don't have it's difficult to sort of go into too much depth here, but a question from Manuel asking me about how you go about validating an idea that you might get from a client or various clients. Are there certain types of question that you should ask yourself? in order to sort of make sure that, you know, what a client or clients are telling you is actually valid. Because we can also be quite sort of self-deceiving as well as consumers. We sort of say one thing and we think we believe one thing, where actually perhaps our behavior sort of indicates another. So are there any sort of validation techniques that you've come up with?
Absolutely, and we actually rarely are listening to what people are telling us, and are much more looking at the body language, the way the home is decorated, how they sit, how they interact with the surroundings, if they take the shoes off during the interview. So around 75% of what we learn from a consumer visit is actually based on what we see, what we smell, but it's not necessarily what they're telling us. And this is really interesting because I think most interviews normally would be almost opposite, if not even worse. So that's one aspect. When we ask questions, we always ask questions in dual ways. And then we have a special methodology, which we call the 7C Manifesto, where we ask certain questions throughout the process which are validating things. I have to tell you that, you know, I've done this now for 15 years, and some of the most successful turnarounds in retail, in the airline industry, in the toy industry, in the coffee industry, basically almost every industry comes out of these small data. So today we know it works, but it also comes down to being willing to think differently, behave differently, and have courage to implement ideas which quite often are very different from what you had in mind. But certainly it works very well. So yes, as you said very rightly so, Chris, I'm going to tell you more about that when we are showing up in Mexico.
Okay, excellent. How skeptical are you about big data? I mean, obviously this is a term that has got so much press, and you would imagine probably rightly so. There's been so much written about it as you know, the insights that big data can give you. Is small data, can it really replace big data, or what are some of the ways in which you can go about sort of combining the two? What are your thoughts around that?
Well, small data and big data is like a partner in a dance. You know, it takes two to tango. And I think the reality here is that we become far too reliant on big data, thinking that it's a holy grail of answers. It's not. And time after time we're seeing in all the different cases around the world that very, very few cases, in fact, have been able to mine data out of big data without needing to have a hypothesis. And a hypothesis, guess what, that comes out of small data. And I think that's where a lot of companies are doing something wrong. They believe that all these data they have is the holy grail of answers. It's not. You need to have a theory first, and that quite often, if not always, comes out of small data. So it really is two yin and yangs coming together here. And I think that's very important to stress. I'm not an opponent to big data. I'm an opponent to the fact that people believe that's the only answer. Just as I would be an opponent just to use small data, you really need to use both sides of the story.
Okay, excellent. Daniela Pacheco asks, how costly is this? Is this an issue where, you know, compared to other methods? Because I think, you know, a lot of the great thing about big data is, you know, you can plug everything into software and you can sort of churn out some insights at the other end. This sounds as though it's more labor intensive in terms of actually spend hours with people in their homes.
Not at all. I tell you, big data processes are incredibly costly because you need to have software, you need to have the hardware, you need to have the talent to mine those data, and then you need to have a constant input of data coming in as well. And all that costs in the millions of dollars to happen. Small data can really be done by a small startup. You know, if you're a mom and pop store, if you're an SME, if you're just a small company, you can afford this. And that is really the difference. I mean, Entrepreneur in the US, the magazine, and even Inc.com, which is a magazine for entrepreneurial businesses, both of them were honoring Small Data the book as one of the groundbreaking books of 2016 because they said finally there's a tool which small businesses can use which doesn't cost an arm and a leg. So no, this is not very costly because you have to remember you don't need to do thousands of interviews. Quite often we know that just 20 or 30 is enough. At least that's the number of people we've been speaking with when we have turned around huge companies around the world.
Okay. Martin, a lot of people know you and your work for the work you've done in terms of understanding what neuroscience and the brain, the phrase neuromarketing. How does this work relate to your research, on neuromarketing and sort of understanding the neuroscience behind consumer behavior?
Well, a lot of the work, so you have to remember, over the years we've conducted by far some of the biggest neuroscience studies in the world. And what we've learned is how to ask questions the right way. So basically we've used heavy and very intensive neuroscience work in order to understand how do we decode signals. What does that behavioral pattern means? How do we interact with consumers in a powerful way? All that stuff is really incredible, powerful insights which have helped us create the foundation for how we today interview consumers and how we pick up small data. So I wouldn't have been able to write the book Small Data and actually do a speech about small data had I not written a book called Biology, BU Biology, because that helped me to give the foundation of how to understand and interact with human beings in a completely new way.
Yeah, yeah. We have Luis Novello is writing in from the Anuak Maya University in Yucatan. He's doing an information technology master's degree, or no, he's a coordinator on the information technology master's degree there, and says that they promote big data analysis amongst their students. Do you have any sort of strategy or advice that you can give to him, to the school, in terms of sort of also incorporating small data in that course and
well, absolutely. I think it's very important that you have a chat with your teachers and you ask your teacher one single question, that is, how do you come up with a hypothesis which you're going to use when you're going to mine those data? Because when you have a data point, you need to navigate yourself through all these data points to find out a solution. And that requires a hypothesis. Who gets that hypothesis? Now, if the person sitting in a lab, in an air-conditioned room, sitting mining data is coming up with an idea, there's a really big risk that actually you will mine the data the wrong way. But if it's a person who have a very close contact and interaction with consumers and in fact have spent time picking up small data, there's a really good chance that actually will come up with something important. Let me just wrap up before I run with a little story about this very topic. A couple of months ago, a major American bank decided to use the big data strategy in order to reach out to all the clients. They learned that there was an enormous amount of churn, so people shuffling around with their bank accounts, and they were very frustrated about it because they knew they were about to lose all the clients. So they decided to prepare some letters, and they wanted to send it out to all the clients to sort of give them a discount and some interest rate cuts and just different tools to attract the customers, or at least to retain the customers. And that was until one day where one clever guy said, hey, instead of just relying on those big data, why don't we interview a couple of consumers? So they went out to the clients in the bank and asked them, why are you shifting around with your bank accounts this much? And guess what the answer mostly was? Well, it was because they're undergoing a divorce. And when you undergo a divorce, you have to separate your accounts into two things, to 2 or 3 different accounts. And the bank was simply not prepared for that. So they had no products offering a family going through divorce how to separate the bank accounts. So out of that, they learned, had they just listened to big data, well, then they would have been doomed. But now listening to small data, in fact, they created a whole new product, and the bank went back again on track. And this is really the argument, that you cannot just work with big data. You need to have 2 dimensions to it. And that's really the philosophy of what I call small data.
Yeah, that's great. No, I think, yeah, the message is definitely clear. And thanks for taking the time today, Martin, to give us that message and to give us this introduction to the ideas in the book, the ideas that you'll be discussing in more detail at the World Business Forum in Mexico next month. So, I certainly feel, more motivated to learn more. So hopefully, the people that are listening will be too. So, as I was saying, to all of you who are out there listening, once again, the information is up there on the screen. If you would like to know, listen to Martin live in person in Mexico. He'll be there on October 26th and 27th. If you would like to register for the event or find out more information, you can go to wobi.com or call the numbers which are there on the screen at the moment, and there'll be some friendly WOBI staff who will be more than happy to give you some more information. So that said, look forward to hopefully seeing as many of you as possible in Mexico City in October. But for today, all that remains for you to do is thank you to Martin for being with us. Martin, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.
And thank you to all of you for listening. And until the next time, in the next WOBI webinar, goodbye.